today. We're going to talk about the different options that you have to integrate with OpenAir. We're going to talk about a few of the more common integrations, particularly in the neighborhood of sales, CRM, accounting systems, HR systems, and document management. We're going to talk through some of the more common hurdles that people run into as they're trying to integrate with OpenAir. There's really four primary approaches for integrating different systems with OpenAir. There is a native integration with NetSuite. So if you're a NetSuite user, they have provided an integration between OpenAir and NetSuite's tools out of the box, if you will. This is something that we'll show you the interface in a little bit. Can take a little bit of custom scripting to get it to do what you want, but by and large, you can integrate with NetSuite without any real difficulty. Second option, OpenAir provides an integration manager tool. That's what they call it, OpenAir Integration Manager. You'll see it abbreviated throughout this presentation as either IM or OAIM. And that is primarily for batch file processing, making mass updates to OpenAir, downloading mass amounts of data from OpenAir is what that tool is designed to do. The third option is to use OpenAir's APIs that they provide, either through an XML or a SOAP interface. That can provide near real-time processing. It can talk to other systems that have APIs. You can build interfaces between them. There's a lot of flexibility there. The last option is one that is fairly recent to the OpenAir community, which is the use of Dell Boomi. Now, Boomi is a tool provided by the Dell Corporation that is designed to do a number of things. What we primarily focus on is its ability to integrate data between disparate systems. And I'm going to leave it at that for now, and we'll come back to that in a few slides so you can see exactly what I mean by that. As far as figuring out which of those four options is going to be useful for you, there are a lot of things that you have to consider. Your own business's processes, your internal systems processes, how important data workflow is to you. Do you need approval processes? Do you need some kind of audit controls for SOX purposes or other purposes, healthcare related, etc.? Do you have resources, technical resources available to do various stages of development? Some of these tools require coding or scripting to accomplish. Some of them do not. What kind of systems are you trying to integrate with, and what interfaces do those systems have that you can send data to and from? And is it worth it? And that probably should be the first question. Is it really worth it? Do you want to go through the trouble of integrating this? Is it worth the money that you would spend and the time that you would spend in doing so? So let's talk about the NetSuite integration first. I'm going to cover all four of those types here. The first one, the NetSuite integration, OpenAir can connect to NetSuite directly. There is scripting logic that I mentioned that can be added for additional field control, but it isn't always necessary. I will say this, in our experience, it is frequently necessary. So that's, if you would look at it as a good news, bad news situation. The bad news is that chances are you're not going to be able to do exactly what you want with the system as it stands, but you would need to add a little bit of scripting to make it work. The good news is that it's not any kind of specialized form of JavaScript or something like that, like some of the scripting in OpenAir. It's really very straightforward, and OpenAir has provided good documentation on how that scripting would need to be done. It's not particularly difficult. You can schedule the runs to and from NetSuite 6 times a day. As you can see in the screen below the words, you can see that you can schedule it every day. And what you do is you give it a block of time. I want this to run between 12 and 1 p.m. You can't be more specific than that. It will take the earliest available server time that it has between 12 and 1 to run that integration. It's almost always much closer to 12 than it is to 1, or much closer to the beginning time than it is to the end. So if you specify 12 p.m. to 1 p.m., you're likely going to get something very close to 12 p.m. And then you can have those results mailed to a particular administrator in your system, so you can ensure that if there were any errors or any faults, that you can see those. On the right side of the screen, you see this is a screenshot from the integration interface within OpenAir that shows you the kinds of data that you can send or receive from NetSuite. So you can see under the getting data from NetSuite, you can pull users, projects, clients, expense items such as airfare, hotel, etc. You can get contacts from NetSuite. You can get services. You can track customer POs, and you can even track payments against your invoices. All that can be brought back into OpenAir. As far as sending data to NetSuite, you can also send those clients and projects back to NetSuite, so any changes that you make in OpenAir can be synced within NetSuite. You can send expense reports and invoices and revenue transactions. And there are more options than this. This is a typical client's setup. There are other internal switches that can be turned on to allow transfer of other pieces of information. If you're interested in things other than what's listed here, we can always talk through what you might be interested in, show you that list that is available to you. And the way that this integration works is exactly as it says. It's a native structure. OpenAir talks directly to NetSuite's database. NetSuite talks directly to OpenAir's database. No need for any middleman. It's cloud to cloud. And that's the last time you're going to hear that. The next integration would be through the use of Integration Manager. And what Integration Manager is exactly as it states here. It's a database export and import tool. It uses field mapping and it uses text files. So what Integration Manager is going to do for you, if you're doing an export out of OpenAir, it'll drop a text file of that data in common delimited format typically to a location you specify. If you want to import data from another system, you've got to have it in that same type of a format, a text file that's delimited that you can load into OpenAir. So Integration Manager does not talk directly to any database or any other system. It's strictly loading and unloading of text files. It can do some data manipulation. It can handle field overrides. It can handle some accounting information summary. So if you need to roll up everything to a certain cost center, it can do that for you. And it's got a pretty good system of logging errors and spitting out what it calls a kickout file for any records that don't load properly. You can then take this tool and you can build what are essentially just Windows shortcuts that can be run through Windows Scheduler that can then run these integrations at whatever given time you choose to. So when you schedule an integration to run, say you're loading data into OpenAir, the integration will run. It will look for the file where you have specified the file should be, and if it finds it, it loads it automatically into OpenAir. And you don't, it's the kind of thing where you can set it up and ignore it and it just runs. So that's the idea behind Integration Manager. I'll show you a brief architecture diagram of that. So OpenAir's data is in the cloud, obviously. Excuse me, I went the wrong way. It communicates with, this is Integration Manager here, communicates with that tool, which then sends text files or receives text files if we're coming through the green arrows, which then need to be picked up or removed if you're coming the other way by your integrated system. Now, some of the things to know about this. First of all, this has to sit on a machine or a virtual machine within your environment. It is, at its core, it's a desktop application, not a server application. That means that it's got to have a login to your Windows environment or your network environment. It's got to have a login into OpenAir. And when we talk about common problems that people have with some of these integrations, that would be the first one right there. What can happen is if you set this up with a username on your network, but your network has that username expiring the password every 90 days, then you have to come in and fix these shortcuts every 90 days. And that, frankly, is that's an obstacle that you want to avoid. If you are going to use Integration Manager, you want to set it up with a system user that does not have an expiring password. Same thing with their OpenAir account. Anytime their OpenAir account changes the password, you'd have to go back in and fix the shortcuts again. So that's something to be aware of. These text files can live on a data share, or they can be sent over FTP or SFTP. Your integrated system, however, has to have some method of importing or exporting those data files in order for this to work. Now, in this day and age, most systems do. Most systems do provide a way of exporting or importing text files. But you would want to make sure that your system can do that before you embark on this path. All right. The next integration method is through an OpenAir API. What OpenAir has provided is the way to extract or import data through XML and SOAP calls. These go directly to and from OpenAir's database. In order to make them work, you have to develop some kind of an infrastructure. Either you have to use some language that allows you to create and send and receive XML and SOAP calls. And at this point, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, then this is not an option you want to pursue. That's about as technically simple as I can make this. It is full custom programming, just like if you were writing any program from scratch. To use the APIs, you would build programs from scratch to implement them. Where this really works, where it says it's more flexible in some cases than Integration Manager, it's more flexible in almost every case than Integration Manager. Integration Manager can do a lot of things for you, but if you need to reach beyond what Integration Manager can do, the APIs are almost guaranteed to be able to accomplish whatever you need, provided that you have somebody on your side with the skill to build the API code properly. This does take more development and implementation time. Now, you might be looking at this thinking, why would anyone do this if it's as much work as I'm making it sound? I will give you an example from my past. I used to be employed by a large healthcare organization that has about 3,000 users on the OpenAir system. They also had the same 3,000 users in their Concur expense system, and their PeopleSoft financial system, and their PeopleSoft HR system. And they wanted to pass data all between these 4, 5, 6 systems without anyone having to monitor it. And so what they did, instead of building, here's an integration between these two systems, and here's an integration between those two systems, they funded a project where they just built an integration engine with all the different APIs in place and used it to pull, they could pull data and push data to and from any of the systems that they had in place. And they used the OpenAir APIs for the OpenAir section of that. And it turned out to be a very slick way of accomplishing what they wanted. It was costly for them, but they've been using that system for 6 years now. And so in the long run, it certainly paid off for them. The typical API architecture is similar to what you saw with Integration Manager. If we're doing an extract, for example, out of OpenAir, we would start in the OpenAir cloud. We'd build our code on a server or servers in our own environment. And when I say servers, typically when you're developing code in this manner, you're using test servers, development servers, production servers, etc. So again, a little bit of an added cost as well there to do this properly. You're compiling executable code, C++, Java, whatever it is that you're using that can produce XML and SOAP calls. That will create XML files, which then can be imported into your integrated system. Now again, this infers that your integrated system can handle XML or SOAP calls as well. Now, the one thing to note is that those XML files don't have to live on a server. You don't have to have a landing place for them. You can just simply pass them from system to system virtually, which is nice. All right, that's an API. Dell Boomi. This, as I mentioned, is a little bit of a newer solution for OpenAir at least. And what this is, this allows direct interaction with both OpenAir and whatever other supported tool you want to use. When I say a supported tool, the way that Boomi is structured is that they build what they call connectors. And they provide the primary engine behind the scenes, which they call an atom. And that atom uses connectors to connect to various systems. And so if you have systems that Boomi has created connectors for, this is a fantastic solution in that you can just simply say, I want to connect from OpenAir to Salesforce, and they have connectors for both. You perform some mapping in the middle, and you're on your way. The list of applications that they have connectors for is pretty significant and getting more significant by the day. They've built, as I listed here, NetSuite, Oracle, PeopleSoft, Salesforce. They also have like Intact. I saw on their list. There's Microsoft Dynamics is on there. There's at least 30 or 40 more. I couldn't provide the entire list in the slide, but I can get. I will add a website when we send out the slides so you can see all the different connectors they have. Now, they don't just connect with different applications, however. If you have an application that they don't have a connector built with, chances are you can still use Boomi and use it well because they can connect directly to databases, MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle. They can connect to a disk system and push out flat files. They can connect to an SFTP server, map data to that. So if they don't have a connector directly to the application you want to integrate with, you can integrate to its database or to its text file structure and load in files in a manner similar that you would do with Integration Manager. In order to use Boomi, you have to configure what they call a Boomi process, which consists of these connectors and then any of the mapping that you want to do in between to say, send this field from point A to point B. That's got a nice graphical user interface that Boomi provides. You can run this completely in the cloud if you are integrating between two cloud-based systems. So for example, OpenAir and Salesforce. You can run this thing completely in the cloud. You don't have to install anything on your environment anywhere. The interface is web-based in the cloud. Everything will be cloud-based and it doesn't require any install on your part. If you are doing any kind of a local integration, for example, QuickBooks. If you're integrating OpenAir QuickBooks through Boomi, well, QuickBooks doesn't live in the cloud. So at that point, you'll need to install one of these atoms, if you will, on a server in your environment. But that's not much different than installing any piece of software in your environment. Now, the last point on this bullet was a moderate learning curve to use the tool effectively. Now, I will say this: some folks think that moderate learning curve is a bit more than moderate. It all really depends on what you're trying to do with it. A straightforward mapping really is not very difficult in Boomi, and it wouldn't take long to figure that out. If you're trying to do more roll-ups and summary values and conditional maps and things of that nature, you probably want to either get some Boomi training or talk to some folks that have Boomi training or experience and get some assistance. In terms of flexibility, Boomi can do a lot of things. It's not going to be quite to the point of an API where you're building whatever it is that you want, whatever you can dream up, you can build. But they've dreamt up most situations that you'd run into. I've yet to see one that they can't handle. And then again, a little bit of an architecture on Boomi. With OpenAir, it starts in the cloud, and then it uses a Boomi connector to connect to an atom, either a cloud atom or a local atom, depending on what you're integrating with on the other end. And then another connector to connect to whatever system you're integrating with. So a Salesforce system would go from OpenAir through an OpenAir connector into a cloud atom, into a Salesforce connector, and into Salesforce, as an example. Okay. So let's take a look at this. This is a rather complex chart. I tried to make this as simple as I could. But this is where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion. In terms of comparing how do I know which one of these I want to use, there's a lot of different factors, more than I could list here. A lot of those are going to depend on your specific business need, not any generic factors such as is it flexible or is it expensive. But if you are looking at the more general factors of flexibility, time to complete an integration, cost to complete an integration, sustainability of that integration, how hard is it to maintain, and the infrastructure that's going to be required on your end to build that. That's why I built this chart. So in terms of Integration Manager, it's not as flexible as the other two options, but it's still got a high degree of flexibility. You can do a lot of things with Integration Manager. It's certainly the quickest by probably a long shot. In fact, definitely a long shot. It's much quicker. Its cost is much less because it doesn't cost anything. Integration Manager is free from OpenAir, and it's just got a downloadable link, and we can get you that link if you're interested. In terms of, I'm going to skip sustainability on this one for just a minute. In terms of infrastructure required, there's very little that's required to run an Integration Manager. You do need a server that it can run on, but that's about it. It's got a pretty small footprint. That can be a virtual server. It can be a virtual server with little RAM or CPU, and it'll run just fine. The sustainability is where things can get into be a little bit of a problem with Integration Manager. As I already noted, any kind of a password change for the schedule user or the OpenAir user is going to cause you problems with Integration Manager. It will require you to update all of your shortcuts. If you want to add a new custom field to the integration, that's not as easy as it probably should be. That's something that you're going to have to plan ahead if you're going to use Integration Manager to do that. Integration Manager is not able to send you logs of its errors. So if it errors, you're not going to know unless you actually go look. Now, there are things that can be done to avoid that. What we've done in certain circumstances is we've built scheduled reports that you can have in your inbox to show you what did Integration Manager load last night. And that can help you identify if there are errors or not. So long story short, Integration Manager is great if you're just looking for a quick and dirty, if you will, batch load or export. You just have to be aware that if you need to make changes to it, it's going to take a little bit to do. Now you see throughout the rest of this, the API method and the Boomi method kind of swap back and forth. The API's flexibility, because you're programming whatever it is you want to do, is very high. You can do whatever OpenAir has exposed. Any data element they've exposed, you have access to, which is 99% of their database. Boomi is very close in terms of flexibility. As I indicated, I haven't seen anything Boomi couldn't handle yet. I only have the API listed as being more flexible because as it's its own coding environment, you can't really do anything. As far as build time is concerned, the API is far and away the longest build time because you have to start from scratch essentially and build code and test code and deploy code and all of that. It can be a fairly sizable endeavor. Boomi provides a lot of the tools for you, so the build time is not nearly as long as it would be with an API. Now the cost, I put this, I should make a note on this. I really do not know the difference in cost between using the API and using Boomi. And the reason I don't know that is because different companies can negotiate different rates with both companies. And so I really can't say for sure that using Boomi is a higher cost option. In my experience, it has been. The API does have a licensing cost that goes with it that you would negotiate with OpenAir. And in my experience, the Boomi cost has been a bit more than what a typical API license cost has been. The thing to note here is that Boomi is licensed per connector. The API is not. Once you have an API license, you have an API license. With Boomi, the more you want to do with it, the more it's going to cost you. The more things you want to connect, the more systems you want to connect, the more it's going to cost. So that's a key consideration in the cost of these systems. In terms of sustainability, the API is as sustainable as any code you'd write yourself, which could be, depending on your organization, it could be very easy to maintain or it could be significantly challenging. With Boomi, everything's built into their environment. And if there's something with, for example, if you have a Salesforce integration and something in the Salesforce cloud architecture has significantly changed, Boomi's going to update their connector so that your process won't have to be touched. So the sustainability of a Boomi system is really high because any of the possible pitfalls that you could run into with those specific systems are covered within those Boomi connectors, and they'll be updated as needed. And then on the infrastructure required, that's a little bit flexible in terms of Boomi because it depends on if you're connecting cloud systems or not. If all you're connecting is one cloud system to another, you don't need anything from an infrastructure perspective. But if you want to do any kind of local integration, you do need some space on a server to install their Atom and do that. With the API, you would need development server space, test server space, production server space, anything that you would need for any kind of software build. So the infrastructure required there is a fairly significant footprint. Okay, so that's my comparison between the systems in terms of these general topics. Again, I wouldn't want anyone to use this information alone to make a decision on what types of integrations are best for your company or if an integration is best for your company. The number one factor in any of these integrations is your specific business processes and needs, which will change from company to company and person to person. So I just want to make that very clear that this is not to be used as a single source to determine if an integration works for you. Okay. In terms of the types of integrations you can do here, what we've seen a lot of Salesforce integrations, and we are recommending Boomi for those integrations. Now, some of you are doing Salesforce integrations with some tools that NetSuite provided at some point. NetSuite has removed support for those. You probably are aware of that. They still function, and there's no reason you can't continue to use them except that NetSuite is no longer in a position where they will support those. So that's just something to be aware of. And so because of that factor, we are recommending Boomi for Salesforce integrations. And we've had good success with that tool in terms of OpenAir to Salesforce and vice versa. With other CRMs, Boomi is also an option there. As I mentioned, it will work with PeopleSoft and it will work with Intact and other systems. And so Boomi can be a good option there. Integration Manager and the API can also be good options. Again, depending on what you're trying to do, what your business processes are, how much you want to spend, how automated you want this to be. So things to consider in this, if you do integrate with these sales tools, chances are your services organization, if you're using OpenAir, doesn't own the sales tool. And so are you going to be able to get the information that you need from that sales tool without actually having control of the sales tool? Will your sales organization have some flexibility to work with you in terms of getting the information in there that you need? Are you going to maintain customers in OpenAir, or are you going to maintain them in your CRM? Typically, it's maintained in the CRM. How does that work for you? Are you able to do that successfully? And do you want this information to flow automatically? Do you want someone to have to review it before it gets into OpenAir or gets pushed back to Salesforce? How much automation do you want to play into that? Those are things you're going to want to think about on top of how much time do I have to build this, and is it worth the cost? In terms of accounting systems, here's what we typically see. With accounting systems, it's typically all about invoice data, getting data from OpenAir's invoices over to another system. We've done this with lots of other systems, NetSuite, QuickBooks, etc., Dynamics. And what people really like about OpenAir's invoicing is that it captures all of the time data exactly as it is, all the expense data exactly as it is. And a lot of times some of these other systems will summarize that data, and they can't necessarily deal with it on a line-by-line basis. And so it's very common for folks to have invoice data or actual charge data going from OpenAir to another system, an SAP or whatever it is that you're using. It's also pretty common for payments to be tracked in this other financial system and sent back over to OpenAir so that your project manager does not need access to the financial tool to be able to see is his customer paying his bills. So that's pretty common as well. Revenue data is not as often integrated. Now, there's no real issues with this. I'm not going to say there's no reason that it's not often integrated because that's not accurate. But there's no technological reason that it couldn't be. What you frequently run into is that the services folks do not control how revenue is recognized. And so the finance folks that do want to maintain that methodology in their finance tool. And so it's not terribly common to have that integrate from OpenAir back to a finance tool. But it is not only possible, but I currently am working with a number of clients who've done that. And it works quite well. Purchases can be integrated if you're using the purchases module in OpenAir. Then it's pretty easy to get purchases to and from OpenAir and these accounting systems. And expense reports, pretty common. Now, typically you have to, with any of these, you got to make sure that you have a system of record. Which one is going to be the real expense report system or invoice system or whatever it is. You have to ensure that early on in the process you've identified this is the system of record. So if you make a change, for example, if you're using OpenAir with Concur as an expense system, and Concur is your system of record for expense reporting, and somebody goes into OpenAir and makes a change to an expense report in OpenAir that came from Concur, are you going to pass that change back to Concur or not? What kind of a workflow do you want to have in place? Those are the kinds of things you have to think about in terms of your systems of record. Very important to identify those. One thing I will note, QuickBooks has a standard integration through Integration Manager. And so if you are using QuickBooks, you can set up Integration Manager on a server in your system to directly talk to QuickBooks and get it information out of OpenAir and vice versa. So that's something to consider if you are using QuickBooks. And of course, as we mentioned, there's a native integration to NetSuite. So that's far and away the simplest integration would be to go to and from NetSuite. HR systems. This is not something we see very often, but it does work pretty well when integrated with OpenAir. You can use it for account creation, so you're not having to create users in OpenAir. All your users are being created in your HR system, typically by your HR team. You can use it to track PTO balances and any other payroll implications that you have in terms of the time that people are putting into OpenAir. You do want to make sure that you're only pulling in the people that you need from your HR system and the information you need from your HR system. And you have to be very careful with HR systems, as you have typically more confidential data there than you will in these other systems. You have to ensure that you've got a good audit process set up after you perform one of these integrations. And document management I'm only going to speak about briefly. If you have access to the Workspaces module in OpenAir, you can in fact send documents to and from other locations in your environment just simply by telling the workspace, my storage location is blank. And you can set up these workspaces with these external links to those areas, and you can get your project documentation to show up in OpenAir, even though it's just simply linking to another location in your network or another location that's available to OpenAir through the cloud. Okay. All right. Got just a few more slides here, and then I can open this up. Here's the things you got to think about and some hurdles we've run into. Do you need real-time integration, or is batch integration sufficient? Most everybody wants real-time integration. Most everybody has been able to live with batch integration. And so you have to make that determination. And a lot of it's going to depend on the kinds of data you're dealing with, and obviously your deadlines and things as it comes to month end. OpenAir's invoice data, as I mentioned before, is in the detailed charge format, and a lot of these other systems and their integrations can't really handle that. They're looking for invoice summaries or line item summaries or things of that nature. One example of this that's not quite the same is something when you have to perform a credit between OpenAir and NetSuite. Now that's a native integration and everything flows smoothly except credits. And the reason for that is that NetSuite has been built such that it can't accept negative values on invoices, whereas OpenAir, that's how it handles credits, is through negative charges on invoices. NetSuite actually has a separate entity called a credit memo that it uses to handle this instead of putting negative numbers on an invoice. So there's some tricks that you have to get into if you're going to try to integrate invoices between those two systems if you have that kind of a situation where you have credits coming through as negative charges in OpenAir. API custom field lookups can be pretty slow. You're going to want to, if you're familiar with the external ID in NetSuite, or excuse me, in OpenAir, you're going to want to use that for most of your lookups. Otherwise, you're going to end up with performance issues and possibly timeout issues. Replacing a currency setting has become a problem for folks. They think that if they switch a customer from, say, from USDs to euros, then all the dollar values in the system, change to euros as well. And in fact, they don't. The numbers stay exactly the same. No conversion happens. So if you are doing something through an API or through any of these tools where you're changing a currency, you have to make sure that you change and convert the actual numbers associated with those as well. The next one hasn't been too much of a problem because it's pretty easy to work around, which is you can get duplicate customers if you're using full names versus nicknames. For example, if you've got international business machines in one system, IBM in the other, and you haven't necessarily mapped the full name to the full name, it's going to map directly to the nickname in OpenAir, and you could end up with both customers in OpenAir. So that's something you have to watch for and be careful. The last point is not so much something to watch out for. It's more just an FYI. If you are interested in taking a look at OpenAir's database structure, and you want to see, if I integrate this, where would this data go? That link at the bottom of this slide points to a website that shows all of OpenAir's database structure, that at least everything that's exposed, and actually a few things that aren't. They do a really good job of keeping this up to date. As they make new releases, they do keep this up to date. They do make the changes to it as needed. The database doesn't change very much. If it changed, with any significance, people's API integrations and all of their integrations would be breaking left and right. And so the database structure does not change much. They do add things to it, but it's rare that they would modify or remove anything. So just an FYI that you can see their structure there. Okay, just a few last points before I open this up. Time savings, obviously very important. Getting data entered, getting data processed. It's why people build a lot of these integrations, is they want these things to go quickly. They want this to be automatic. But you've got to make sure in all of this that you're not sacrificing accuracy. Now, the flip side of that coin is that by building these integrations, you are typically removing the human element, which in theory at least should improve your data accuracy. Okay? So that's something to be considered as well. It may not be that you're integrating because you want things to be automated and quickly. You may be integrating because you want things to become more accurate, and you don't want people to mistype this or misunderstand this or misread that. And that can be a significant benefit if you find that you're having data issues. And that kind of brings us to the second point. Automating these integrations can enforce compliance. You have to do it this way because there's no other way to do it. The system pulls this data from Salesforce. You don't have the option of creating a project or what have you in Salesforce, or at least most people don't. You can limit that to a set number of administrators. And so it has to come through this way. It has to come through that way. The invoices have to have this information on them or they won't transfer to NetSuite. These integrations can help you ensure that you're meeting your compliance needs. And then the last point we talked about, can reduce missing data, can reduce manual efforts and human mistakes. So your accuracy really should improve. If you are interested in pursuing any of these options, we would love to help you. I, in particular, would love to help you. I am wired a little bit differently, where I love to build integrations and scripts and that kind of thing. And most folks that are using the system think that I am insane for that, and they may be right. But I really do enjoy it. And frankly, at least in my humble opinion, I think we're pretty darn good at it. We have done many of these integrations and more every day. We do have Dell Boomi certification within our team. We have folks within our team that are not yet certified but have significant Boomi experience. And so if you are interested in pursuing Boomi, we'd love to help you with that. We've been using the OpenAir tool and a lot of these APIs and integrations for a long time. So we'd be happy to help you with that. Obviously, you know who we are. You wouldn't be on the webinar